30 panelists, 6 panels, 9 hours of in-depth analysis and discussions, audience question and answer sessions, book signings, public receptions. We are here because we believe in truth. We value truth. Yet somehow, despite all our technological advances, truth seems harder to find than ever before. The idea for this symposium began almost a year ago during the presidential campaign. I was talking with William Kennedy, the founder, executive director of the Writers Institute, and my mentor. We both worked as reporters at the Times-Union. We love newspapers. We understand the essential role that journalists play in a free and open democratic society. But we became troubled when we started hearing things like fake news and alternative facts. And then President Trump declared the media the enemy of the people. The attacks grew more vitriolic. The bitter political divide widened. The nation grew ever more polarized. We kept screaming at each other across our Facebook posts. But somewhere along the line, we stopped listening to each other. That's why we brought together these distinguished panelists and moderators, because they are acclaimed journalists, leading scholars, brilliant communicators. We want the next 2 days to be stimulating, illuminating, and perhaps inspiring. We know that these are difficult topics that we'll address, and there will be disagreement and a divergence of opinion. But we urge all of us here in Page Hall to be respectful, to practice the art of civil discourse, and to summon our better selves. We'll invite audience members to come to the microphones here in the auditorium in the last 15, 20 minutes of the conversation. But we ask that you ask your questions succinctly and refrain from making long statements or rambling monologues. All of the panels are being videotaped by Viking Video today and tomorrow. They're being streamed live across the internet. They'll be archived for later use. And all the audience participation will be part of that lasting archive. We'll make announcements as necessary throughout the symposium. You've got programs with the times and panels and the panelists. Staff from our university bookstore are out front in the lobby with books of our panelists, and they'll be around afterwards for signing. And also, please remember to bring, if you didn't today, if you're coming back tomorrow, donated children's books, used children's books that we're collecting, grassroots givers. Each week, they're filling 625 backpacks of children in need, young school children in Albany, with food, supplies, and a book. These are children who come from households that don't have books. So if you have a chance to bring some books for the kids, that would be wonderful. We'd appreciate that. So are we ready to get started? Panel 1, Media in the Age of Technology, Fake News, Information Overload, and Media Literacy. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Franklin Foer is a staff writer of The Atlantic magazine, former editor of The New Republic, and the author of a new book, World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. Please welcome Franklin Foer. David Goodman is a contributor to Mother Jones Magazine, host of the radio show The Vermont Conversation, author of several books, including Democracy Now!, 20 Years Covering the Movements Changing America, co-authored with his sister, Amy Goodman. Please welcome David Goodman. Maria Hinojosa is an Emmy Award-winning radio talk show host, anchor, and executive producer of the long-running NPR show Latino USA. She is also the founder of the Futuro Media Group, that harnesses community-based journalism to tell overlooked and underreported stories. Please welcome Maria Hinojosa. Tim Wu is a professor at Columbia Law School, the originator of the net neutrality theory, and author of the books Master Switch, The Rise and Fall of the Innovation Empires, and The Attention Merchants, The Epic Scramble to Get Inside Our Heads. Please welcome Tim Wu. And finally, our moderator, who really needs no introduction. Bob Schieffer is the author of the new book, Overload, Finding the Truth in Today's Deluge of News, which more than 450 University at Albany students are reading this semester in their classes. He's also the former anchor of CBS Evening News and Face the Nation, moderator of 3 presidential debates, member of the Broadcasting Hall of Fame, and he was named a living legend by the Library of Congress. Please welcome Bob Schieffer.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much, and on behalf of the panel, it's such a pleasure to be here. Can I just tell you one story? As I was seeing this full house here, I had no idea, and I bet you guys didn't either, of how many people were going to be here. Not so long ago, I was giving a speech at a little school down in Louisiana, deep in the Cajun country. It was a beautiful spring day, and I got there. It was an old-fashioned auditorium. Every seat was filled. There were students sitting in the aisles. Down this side, next to the podium, there were these big windowsills. The windows had been open. There was no air conditioning there. And there were kids sitting in the windowsills, and I looked out the window near the podium, and 3 kids had climbed up in a tree. And they were sitting there to watch what was going on. And I said, you know, this takes my breath away. I'm really touched that so many young people would show up on a day like this, and the kid on the front row said it's mandatory. So, I assume nobody made you guys come, which makes it all the more wonderful that you're here. So we want to talk about this thing. I have this friend, Jane Hitchcock, who's a novelist and a mystery writer, and she is convinced that Satan has come back to Earth disguised as a smartphone. She said, you know, he never said he was coming back with horns and carrying a pitchfork. She thinks the internet is Satan. Well, I don't go that far, but I have come to the conclusion that this technological revolution that we're going through in communications is having as profound effect on our culture, especially on how we get our news and our politics, is having as profound effect as the invention of the printing press did on the people of that day. We look at all the great things that came about after the invention of the printing press. Literacy improved. We had, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, but what we sometimes forget, there was also 30 years of religious wars, and it was probably 3 decades before Europe finally reached some kind of equilibrium. We are not there yet. I think we're in maybe the first trimester of this communications revolution that's going on, and we're only now beginning to try to understand what it's all about. A big part, I look like the absent-minded professor with all this stuff here. A big part is the impact that that is coming about because of the change in how we get the news. 67% of us now get at least some of our news from social media, especially Facebook. You're all familiar with some of the criticism that Facebook has come under lately. And so I want to start out. Sheryl Sandberg, the Facebook executive, was in Washington this weekend on kind of a charm offensive to try to turn some of this around. And one of the things, according to one of the people at one of the congressional meetings that she had, said that she said 10 or 15 times, what we have to do is do better. So I'm going to just throw that out to the panel. And Tim, why don't I start out with you? What does Facebook have to do better, and do you expect them to do it?
I think that's a huge challenge for them. Because, so I worked in Silicon Valley for years, and what you're talking about is a fundamental cultural shift for these companies. They're used to them thinking of themselves as tech companies. All we do is build the pipes or build the platform, and whatever happens, happens. It's not our business. That has been sort of the mantra for the last 20 years. So now look what's happened. Saying we're doing better really requires a revolution, and not for the least of which is their business model is part of the problem. So doing better means fundamentally rechanging a business model, which right now depends on giving people exactly what they want to see, what makes them most angry, upset, fired up, and usually that's if you hate Trump, something about how bad Trump is, and if you love Trump, something about how great he is, and you get that every day, and that makes the most money. So, saying they do better is right at the core of their business model.
I'd like the rest of you to join in on that, because 67% of us are now getting at least some of our news on social media, and most of those are people who get their news on Facebook, which is great, but what you have to understand is what comes on Facebook hasn't been vetted in the way we traditionally expect the news to be from the mainstream media.
Right, so there's the issue of making money off of all of this, right? You're talking about the business model. Because that's exactly where I come from, come from in terms of understanding what's happening here. They're getting paid, and they want to get paid, and we live in a society where getting paid is what you're supposed to do, and that is the motif. So when you were saying that, I was like, well, really is, I didn't think I was going to start so early, but it really is a push for public media, right? In the sense that public media does not have that interest. I'm waiting for you guys to applaud.
But Maria, what do you mean when you say public media? Are you talking about some sort of government-supported media?
Okay, Bob. So the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is what you pay for. I love that. Now, wait. I'm actually, that's interesting, because I'm like, I don't know if you should be applauding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It is a government institution. You should be holding them accountable, is what you need to be doing, not just like, well, they're there, because this all gets to, from my perspective, who's deciding what ads are being bought, what ads are being put out there, what the narrative is that is going to be put out by Facebook, whether it's pro-Trump or anti-Trump, or who's deciding what is the narrative or what will be funded for public media. So I guess I'm coming back to the place of there's a bigger conversation around who has the power to make these decisions, and what is that power motivated by. Again, I don't I don't use Facebook a lot. Sorry, it's just not my thing. I do use Twitter and Instagram. But who is deciding on Facebook what ads are going to be sold and at what profit? And who are those people, right? I mean, are they some lowly guy who's just getting a phone call like, oh, we want to,
It's an algorithm. Frank will maybe speak to this too, but it's not a person.
So then you guys, the tech people, have to figure out how to deal with this, because I'm still, a human.
David?
Well, I want to turn, I don't want to let the media and the mainstream media off the hook so quickly and blame the great duopoly of Google and Facebook, which now dictates what you read. When we think about how we got where we are right at this moment, look at what the major networks did during the campaign in terms of free media. This is without the help of Google and Facebook. Can anybody take a guess the dollar value of the free media that Donald Trump received in the course of the campaign? Anybody? I heard billion, but I didn't hear the number, but you're on to something there. Somebody's saying 2 billion, you're lowballing it.
10.
Oh, Maria, you're so pessimistic. It was $5 billion in free media. That was more than the value of the media for Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and Paul Ryan, even though he wasn't running for president, he was in the news a lot. Those 5 leading figures were dwarfed by the amount of free media that Donald Trump was given. And as we know, he actually paid for relatively little media of his own. He didn't need to. He understood the dynamics of media, that this blend of infotainment and outrageousness and insults, that would garner the headlines, that would draw the cameras. I saw this firsthand. I live in Vermont, and so I'm your neighbor. When Donald Trump decided to come to Burlington to, sort of land in the middle of Bernie Sanders' country and do a big event. So MSNBC came up to cover the local response to this. Well, I'm watching this, and I was there, and Chris Hayes had come up, and he's assembled all these local people to talk about it, but he never really talks to them. The whole time, it's trained on first an empty podium where Trump is about to speak and his logo's on the thing, and then when he speaks. So even when they travel outside of the, Washington or whatever bubble, they're still glued to the images, and, Trump is a master of stagecraft. So what does that mean? It means that you are getting a non-stop stream of stagecraft and propaganda that is being passed off as news by the corporate media. That's where I think the focus needs to remain, and this is an accountability moment for the media, and the media needs to do better, but also echoing Maria's point, independent media, nonprofit, public media, I really think that that is where the great hope lies, and this election has brought that into very sharp relief.
Franklin, do you want to get into this? Because I'm going to have to respond to what David just said. So I can do it now or after you.
I don't think we could just make a monolithic critique of mainstream media, of corporate media, and say that that's, they could do better. There's no doubt that they could do better. They could do a lot better. And there were all the ways in which you described Trump exploiting that system is real and true. But I think there are things that have happened in the last decade that exacerbate the problem, and I think we do need to understand what's happened, because I don't think Donald Trump could have gotten elected president 20 years ago. The media environment has shifted, and the dependence on Facebook that journalism experiences is at the core of the problem. Because Facebook is exactly what Tim described, which is it's this giant feedback loop. Facebook has data. What is data? Data is a portrait of the inside of your head. Data is everywhere you've traveled on the web. It's everything you've read. It's everything you've purchased. Facebook knows what your religion is, what your political preference is. They know what your pleasure points are, what your anxieties are, and they take that data and they use it to generate, their algorithms sort your news. They provide hierarchy for the news. So the things that will keep you most engaged on that site, that will occupy the most of your attention, to borrow Tim's conceit from his book, are the things that they array. And so we've seen the way in which it's worse in journalism, because journalism needs revenue, and it gets its revenue through Facebook, especially with print media and digital media. But it's also true for the news networks as well. And so Facebook's algorithm is something that everybody is catering to. And so it's resulted in even greater conformity, greater rush to do the thing that's most popular. And what's really dangerous about this system is I've just explained to you the way in which relatively good actors and journalists exploit it. Bad actors are exploiting it too, as we've seen with the Russians. But I think that when Sheryl Sandberg said Facebook could do better is also an admission that they've probably done worse. And Facebook actually deserves, I think, blame for creating the underlying circumstances that enabled Donald Trump, which is that when you're constantly hearing the news that confirms your bias, it weakens you intellectually. You become susceptible to fake news, to propaganda, to demagogic appeals. And while I share David's assessment that the news media didn't do a great job in this election, that Hillary Clinton had a really substantial policy agenda that was dwarfed in the face of all of Trump's showmanship and just ridiculous bluster in the way in which it just seems incredible that this guy got taken seriously to begin with. Facebook is a real part of the problem.
That's, I certainly agree with you, and I want to go back what you're talking about, the algorithms and all of that. I did an interview with Peter Hart for the book that I wrote, who's kind of the dean of American pollsters, and he agreed that we've got to figure out some way to do better with these polls. But one of the things he said to me, and I was surprised that he said it, he said, you can do all of these algorithms and you can find out all of these things, but you cannot find what's in a person's heart. And he said, that's the part we have to do a better job at. And he said, one of the reasons that a lot of these newspapers have come to depend so much on polling now is they no longer, because they can't afford it anymore, have enough reporters to go out and do what local reporters used to do, and that was just simply go out and knock on doors. Go to the opening of the new car dealership. What do you think? Why are you feeling this way? Kind of the old-fashioned shoe leather reporting that's kind of out of fashion now because we come to think of these algorithms as some sort of higher level of learning, which in fact maybe they're not. And I think we have to understand those limitations. Another part that's so difficult for our polling now, we used to, the CBS News, New York Times poll, which is a good one, as good as there is, we used to have to call 3,000 people to get 1,500 people to respond. We now have to call 30,000 people to get 1,500 people to respond. And this is because nobody wants to talk to anybody on the telephone anymore and give out any kind of, I mean, I don't, and I wouldn't. And which makes me wonder, when you finally get the 1,500, who are those 1,500? And so we've just got to figure out a better way to go about doing this. But I got to go back and talk a little bit about what David said. I had the same question you did in the beginning, David, about Donald Trump showing up on so many television programs, especially in the morning. So I called Mika Brzezinski, who is the co-host on Morning Joe, and I said, Mika, you guys are having Trump on all the time. Why don't you ever have Hillary Clinton? And she said, getting an interview with Hillary Clinton is like getting an interview with Mother Teresa, who's dead. And the more I thought about it, what happened in this campaign, Trump, who I do not believe is a very good politician, but he does know a whole lot about television. What he figured out early on is if you call a certain number of television programs, you'll get on a certain number of them. And if you say something that maybe nobody else has said, you'll get invited to be on some more. He ran kind of a new kind of campaign under new rules, where the Clinton people ran an old-fashioned campaign under the old rules. And that is, number one, you never put your candidate in a position where she might be asked a question that she doesn't know the answer to. So you're very careful about who you give an interview to. You're very careful about where she appears. And before the Clinton people figured out what had happened, they had been simply swamped by Donald Trump. I mean, you know, people criticized us for saying we didn't push back enough. We pushed back, but as we were pushing back here, he was already over here raising another issue. That's not illegal. You know, that's not illegal that he figured this out. But I think Hillary Clinton, who I think is eminently qualified, but what I come back to is how is it that the Democratic Party came up with only one person that had a national following. And that's what happened, and her main competition turned out to be someone who wasn't even a Democrat. I think that says a lot more about what's happened to our political electoral system than it does to the way the media covered it.
Can I get on this question
Sure.
on the issue of how Trump was playing a different game and what that says about our media environment? Because I think you can learn about it. I don't think it's only that he mastered television, although as a former television star who had pretty good ratings, well, he talks about it all the time, so you know that. But actually, I think I read one of these stories about him where the only time someone saw him so truly depressed, and it was after the ratings for The Apprentice went down. It was like he caught that bug at some point, where ratings were it more important than money. Ratings. But he also really understood the online environment in a way that
and
no
he
one has.
spoke in the language
Right.
that people speak in a blog thread.
Right, and I'll say, I would put it this way, I'm going to be a little academic about it and say that he understood there were two contests going on. One was the supposed contests where, you're scoring points, saying the right thing, playing the game. After every debate, the commentator would say, well, Trump lost that debate. He was obviously beaten by Rubio. I'm talking about the Republican primary, who he beat everyone there, and they had a lot of contestants. He was always fighting the battle for attention, and he said, all right, there's this other thing, but really, it's like reality television where there's the contest, but the real winner is whoever everybody remembers. And every single time, he won the battle for attention. And it makes you realize that is really the commodity here. That is where he saw that from the beginning. And I think that is what, this links back to Facebook, the game here is all about winning the attentional battle. And Facebook's business model, to go back to that, is basically, as Frank was saying, feeding you exactly what you want to see. Algorithms have figured out that is going to keep you there the longest. Facebook is designed for one thing, time on site, to addict you to this product so you stay the maximum time on it and watch it. So they are also playing the attentional game. And it's almost in a world where if you're not playing that game, it's like it's sort of a sad verdict on civilization. When everything becomes about ratings and the attentional game, whoever people remember wins, something suffers. Something, called the merits. The merits are lost.
Let me just throw another question out on the table for the panel, and I want to see what your reaction is to this. This was not an election about issues. It was an election about attitudes. And I base that on just reporting. And I've been interviewing Donald Trump for 30 years, but I'd never seen him on the stump. So at the South Carolina primary, myself and Lucy Boyd, who's one of the co-authors of this book, she works at 60 Minutes now, before he spoke, I said to Lucy, you go on that side of the room, and I'll go on this side, and just ask these people, what is it they like about Trump? Well, probably between the two of us, we interviewed 40 people, just, asked them a couple questions. And to a person, they said, I like him because he's willing to stand up and say what he believes. They weren't interested in the details and so forth. And, during the campaign, we got accused of taking him literally but not seriously, while his followers did just the opposite, which led me to this conclusion. When a candidate says something, but you don't think he really means it, how do you cover that when you're writing the story? Candidate so-and-so said X, but I don't think he really meant it. How do we deal with that in the real world, Maria?
So, Bob, there's something that David said that I actually want to go back to that I think is underlying what actually has happened. So not just the role of the media, which is responsible in many ways, but who in the media? So I hate to kind of keep bringing this back up, but since I am the only woman on the panel, and I am the only Latina, in fact, the only Mexican. Are you guys Mexican?
I have Chinese, I don't know.
Okay, so, but actually I'm saying that because being Mexican in the age of Trump means something very particular. I think it's interesting that you're laughing. It's actually...
No, I think you're right.
I know I'm right. Come on, you guys, like, okay, now I'm going to make a joke because I want you to laugh, but I wasn't trying to make you laugh before. But here's the joke, which is that I'm 5 things that this president does not like, right? I'm Mexican, I'm an immigrant, I'm a journalist, I'm a woman, and I'm flat-chested. Make you guys, you know, if you want to laugh, we can laugh. But seriously, the problem here is, one of the problems is not just the technology, but the fact that actually US media has become less diverse since 9/11. So we have fewer people of color, journalists, women, immigrants, Muslim, LGBTQ, lo que sea, fewer now than before September 11th. So the whole kind of how did we get here, right? And you were talking about the mainstream media is like, so why did I form my own nonprofit media company, right? Because I didn't know this at the beginning. I am the only Latina who runs a nonprofit independent media company in the country. Thank you. I didn't say it for applause. It's not about that. It's the fact that I am like you. I am just an American like you. But the way I see the world is different, right? I mean, Bob and I love Bob Schieffer. Who doesn't love Bob Schieffer? I mean, you know, I guess a few people, but
Let me tell you something.
well, anyway, the point is that
I'll show you my emails sometime.
right. We see the world as journalists, but also differently. And so, all I'm saying is that there is a sense of how the mainstream media was reporting about the diversity that is happening in our country. And part of the reporting about it was like, oh my God, people of color, immigrants, oh, look at the data, demographics. And that, as much as the Republican Party, was part of setting the tone of what you said, Bob, which was issues and attitudes, and the attitudes being, I'm so glad that he's basically talking like about race the way I talk about race. And that is it's not a conversation that is easy to have. In fact, it's a conversation that is challenging to have without the diversity of the conversation. So I just want to add that. It's not just the technology. It's what, as you had said, media, mainstream media, journalists that lack diversity have actually been creating, and that we're all bearing this, or sowing the seeds of that.
You made an interesting, Bob, you made an interesting point when you said, you know, the only person the Democrats could field was Hillary Clinton. I didn't view it so much as a Democrat-Republican thing. I think that, look what happened to Bernie Sanders. It's about ideas. The only ideas deemed acceptable were a very narrow wedge of the pie. So Bernie Sanders shows up, and at first he experiences what became known as the Bernie Blackout. He just wasn't there. This is a self-described socialist, a guy with very progressive views. So first he's ignored, then he's mocked. His crowds are getting bigger and bigger. This was the alternative viewpoint on the progressive side of the spectrum. Can you imagine if Bernie Sanders received even a fraction of what Donald Trump received? Donald Trump, whose ideas, misogynist, xenophobic, all the things that we know he is, those were somehow deemed acceptable coming from, even though he's coming from a mainstream party. But Bernie Sanders, who's mounting a vigorous challenge to Hillary Clinton, and a very legitimate challenge, is just struggling to break through and get the kind of coverage, to the point where the New York Times public editor finally had to acknowledge, sort of like putting fish on a scale and looking at the amount of coverage being given. You know, the sense of Clinton as an heir apparent was so powerful that it simply dictated coverage.
But here's the point that I would make. What could the media do about that? I mean, we were not the ones who were his campaign manager, but we did. We did. And we, you know,
cover it and don't bury it. I mean, this reminds...
Let me just finish this thought.
Sure.
Part of the reason that Donald Trump got this coverage in the beginning is while Hillary was getting a couple of hundred people to turn out, he was getting 10,000. Well, that's news. And I think that's what we're in the business of, is covering news. And I would just add that. But go
Right.
ahead.
Well, you may recall Bernie Sanders was also getting those 10,000 crowds.
Well, we started to cover him.
You were a little late to the party, though. Yes, you started to cover it. I mean, it reminds me of the run-up to the Iraq War, where voices, anti-war voices, were frozen out of the mainstream media. There was a study done.
Well, I'm not sure I understand. I follow you on that.
So let me give you an example. In the run-up to, there was a very famous moment. We go into Iraq in late March of 2003. In February is when Secretary of State Colin Powell goes to the United Nations to make his final sales pitch to the world. And so Foer, the Media Watch Group, did a study of all of the pundits and people who were quoted on the three networks, CNN, PBS. 393 people were consulted as to their views on the war. So you might say, well, there's a good sampling. How many of those 393 do you think expressed an anti-war viewpoint? Anybody? 300 over here, I hear. It was 3. 3 out of 393. That's not a mainstream media. That's not reflecting what's going on. It's reflecting a very narrow debate between Democrats and Republicans who, when it comes to war, agree.
I'm not questioning your word, but I've never seen that study. I think I need to check on that one.
Well, it's, just to pile on a little bit, but both pile on and dispute you. Thank you. It's not like Hillary Clinton's campaign coverage was that fair. Hillary Clinton, the email scandal dominated the news, which was a relatively, in my opinion, trivial scandal. And then it kept coming back again. And there was a way in which even her ideas weren't necessarily adjudicated or covered with the depth that you would want. Just looking at her platform, which was really, in the end, pretty interesting and actually more, in a lot of ways, more progressive than any modern Democrats. You wouldn't have actually known that necessarily. But I want to just pan back to the discussion of the core question, which is, we're talking about a post-truth situation. And I think for all of mainstream media's faults, one of the things that our society lacks right now is a common basis for fact. That if we were to travel back in time just a little bit, I don't think that this is nostalgic. I think that our ability to adjudicate facts was flawed in probably a lot of ways that David would describe. But there were certain things that you could say people would have to listen to, would have to respect with some sort of authority because it was printed in the New York Times or because it was reported on the big networks. And so we're in this world in which the internet is great in a lot of ways. It's created it creates potentials for diversity and for emancipation and liberation in ways which we should celebrate. But one of the ways in which I think we need to take the threat seriously is how when you consume news now, it's undifferentiated. Everything is about the headline, about the photo. It's not about the source of the news. And the source of the news actually matters. And as consumers of news, we should be able to differentiate. As citizens, we need to be able to differentiate where news is coming from in order to make good choices about what it is. But with Facebook, it's just a feed. You're being fed this monolithic stream that's been created to appeal to you. And I just don't know how we get back to a place when we have problems that are seriously existential when it comes to, say, climate or even things that mass deportation, or there's any number of things that are where you can't even have a conversation in a national sort of way because of just the complete collapse of this structure.
Can I throw out a word?
Think, go ahead,
I
Tim.
just want to throw out
Oh,
a
go
word
ahead, Marie.
that I feel that we're not talking about enough because it's a horrible word, especially for journalists, and to think of it in context of our great democracy, which is propaganda. And I don't think that we, as American journalists, have sat down and had enough time post-Trump election to actually think about what is going on in terms of the use of propaganda. And again, lies. I mean, we as journalists have to, how do we report on the fact that we know that this president is a serial liar? It brings no joy to myself or any other journalist. I'm sure that this is not something that Bob Schieffer would love to have coming out of his mouth, to say that our president is a liar. Who wants to say that? But at the same time, we have to understand how we work around that and propaganda.
And we do. I mean, we do fact check things, and when the president says something that we think is untrue, we report that. I don't know if we call it a lie, but we certainly call it false and say it's not true.
What he just said about Puerto Rico, just for example, what did he say? Like, this has been the greatest ever, whatever, and it's like, no, it's not. It has been a disaster. What you have done to Puerto Rico is a disaster, and just calming down now. Remember, Puerto Ricans are American citizens. All they need to do is when they leave the island, because they cannot vote for president when they live on the island. They can be sent to war by the president when they live on the island, but they cannot vote. But once they are on the mainland, they can vote, they can register. So, vamos a ver, Donald Trump, what just happened with what you did with Puerto Rico?
Let me just add one thing to that. What happened in Puerto Rico, we showed it. We quoted him. We put it on television over and over again, and I'll tell you something, those pictures don't need many words to go with them. People took away what they took away from that, and they didn't need much guidance on that. So I feel like we did our job on that. Tim?
Yeah, so actually, I had the same reaction after, which was, I think it is important to understand that we are almost shockingly and surprisingly back in a golden age of propaganda. So for my last book, I did a lot of research into the heydays of propaganda in this country and around the world, mainly during the First, Second World War. And it begins with many of the things we see today. Propaganda experts always understand that the key is absolutely grabbing the entire nation's attention to make sure that people are listening before you get to the merits, the complicated merits, really just winning these wars for attention. And then also, this is obviously coming from Germany, but the big lie is a big deal. You go with the big lie, and you absolutely have to just murder the facts and create. There's this line in the famous propaganda manual, which I won't mention because it's too controversial, where they said you have to offer an absolutely seamless version of the truth. If you allow one hint of the other side's vision, then everything falls apart. And I think we are living these worlds where people live in their own seamless kind of worlds of alternative facts. It's very dangerous. And I'll say on top of it, we've opened, and this comes to the structure of this isn't blaming media, this is back to the structure of our information environment, is it's become one very vulnerable to exploitation. Once again, because frankly, propaganda is often more interesting and more self-confirmatory of what people want to see. In a way, Facebook is a propaganda machine based on the idea it gives you back what you want. And that's often much more successful with the business model. Satisfying what people want is what they want to hear already. So it's the feedback loop is a propagandic feedback loop. The fact it's been open to exploitation, particularly by the Russians, shows you that we have really opened our environment and desperately in need of a fix, because we are absolutely, right now, maybe the most vulnerable we've ever been since World War I, World War II, to propaganda controlling our lives.
I think those are all excellent points. And going back to what Franklin said about what we're basing our opinion on, and I think that's one of the things that sometimes we don't realize what has happened. Back in those days when we had 3 television stations in every town, and every town had a pretty good newspaper, we based our opinion on the facts that they got from those 4 sources. And while we didn't always agree with the editorial policy, we assumed that what was on the front page of the newspaper, or what Walter Cronkite or what Huntley and Brinkley reported, was true, and that they wouldn't have broadcasted or printed it unless they had gone to some trouble to check it out. Well, all of that is out the window now, because now with so many sources of information, some good, some bad, and some in between, besieging us from all sides, we're no longer basing our opinions on the same set of facts, on the same common data. The people who listen to this channel over here or read this publication over here get their own set of facts, and the folks that listen to the people on the other side of the spectrum, they get their facts. And so we are basing our opinions on different data. And I think that's one of the things that has made this thing so complicated that we're involved in right now. And one thing to say about Facebook and what they're going through right now, this is extremely complicated. How do you figure out how to keep the lies off without interfering with political discourse? I mean, David and I have said a couple of things out here that obviously we don't agree on, but I wouldn't feel right if he wasn't allowed to say what he feels and I'm not allowed to say what I feel. Parody. How do you deal with that? I mean, surely we don't want a world without parody. We don't. Surely we want to hear what Jon Stewart and Colbert and these guys say every night, because they've become like the editorial cartoonist at a newspaper, who is the only person on the newspaper who has the right to lie. I mean, that's what he does for a living, and it helps us to understand. Surely you don't want to censor that. So this is an extremely complicated thing that we're doing. You seem like you want to say something,
Yeah,
Franklin.
so, I mean, one different way of putting it is that in a democracy, we always have gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And those are, information flows through a gate. And there's somebody who's making a decision about what's important, what's true, what's false. And the world that you were describing, there was, the gatekeepers were not blameless, but there was at least there was kind of,
There was a curation.
There was a multiplicity of them, and the problem right now is that you have a couple companies that have become the biggest gatekeepers in human history, and I'm talking about Google, and I'm talking about Facebook largely, but also to a lesser extent Apple and Amazon. And the news is flowing through their gates, but it's done in such a way that, first of all, it's based on this data, which is used to kind of addict and manipulate you. Secondly, it's done in a way where we're not even able to perceive exactly what's happening. There's this illusion that you're in charge, that Facebook is just your friends sharing information with you. And so I think that's part of the danger, which in a way it makes it, as Tim said, perfectly ripe for the exploitation of a demagogue.
And one of the things that's so dangerous is that once it gets out there, it's like crabgrass. You cannot get rid of it. I mean, there are still a certain number of people, a fairly sizable percentage of Americans, who believe Barack Obama was not an American citizen, that he wasn't born in this country. Now, how much fact-checking is it going to take to finally take that down? And that's what the problem is now, and that's why this is much different than even going back to the Nixon administration, when we were having our problems with them, and they were having their problems with us. Now this stuff goes around the world and back in a matter of seconds, and it's out there. This poor pizza owner, the pizza parlor owner man in Washington, that they were supposed to be, Hillary was running a porn ring in the basement, and it was just totally made up out of whole cloth, but somebody showed up with a rifle and shot the lock off the door to get down to the basement to save these children. Well, of course, there isn't a basement there. There's nothing to it, but the man who owns that pizza parlor still has to hire a private security force, because he's still getting death threats every day. And that's what we're dealing with today. And that's the part that we're going to have to find some kind of handle for, and I don't know if we've got it
Bob,
yet.
The
Maria.
thing about people in our country still believing that Barack Obama was not born here, what are we really talking about? Thank you. It didn't take, that was like 2 seconds before somebody said racism. It is something that is a part of who we are. And if I was to say that what part of what needs to be done better is to have a conversation about, you know, I don't know if I want to call it the big lie, you know, in our country, but the fact that we have an issue around race and racism and change and diversity and demographic change. And we have to, in fact, be able to talk about it from, like in the journalism that we do, from a place of humanity, which means I'm always, by the way, spending a lot of time talking to Trump supporters, Latino Trump supporters. But the conversation around our issues around race and demographic change, these are delicate conversations, and they have, in fact, the Republican Party has been talking about this with dog whistle or not so dog whistle for what? Let's just say since Ronald Reagan? So
No, I think 1965, the passage
Okay,
of the
since
Civil Rights Act.
I was a little bit younger then, but so I don't remember. But okay, the point is that it is a very sad part of who we are, and it makes me very sad to think that when the people who I speak to, and they would say, and I would ask, what do you love about Donald Trump? They say, just says it like it is. You know, what is that? And what is that about who we are? And so this is where the work that I do as a journalist actually takes a second, you know, it takes a back seat, because what I do is I talk to people everywhere, right? Because there is also this humanity that, forget Facebook, forget Twitter, forget all of that. It is the humanity. And when we're able to have conversations, and the great stuff about being a journalist, right?
Yeah.
Is that when we can have that conversation and then put it out there in our media. But there are things that are difficult to label and not technological that we also have to talk about.
So I'd like to just, who else would like to say something, and then we'll go to the
One more, if
audience.
that's all right. Do you want to go?
Yeah.
You-
I'll
you've been
just add a word about propaganda, because I do think we are, and we've all kind of picked up on a piece of this. It's enormously powerful, whether it's racist propaganda or political propaganda or a combination of the two. And, you know, I think that how did we get to the place where we are so prone to consuming this, to believing this? Well, you know, again, I would, and where we're at the point where we're not trusting what we're hearing from certain sources. You know, again, I go back to an experience. I think that the Bush years, and particularly in the run-up to the war, sort of laid the ground for where we are today. And while people like to view Trump as, you know, kind of something extreme, we have seen a dry run of this. You know, when we were sold a war based on lies, that was an artful sell job. It was a marketing campaign. The marketing campaign actually had a start date. You know, Andrew Card, who was the chief of staff to George W. Bush, was asked, he had been the chief lobbyist for General Motors prior to going to the White House. He was asked, why did you start this campaign for the Iraq War in September? It was September 2002. And he said, well, everybody in marketing knows you don't roll out a new product in August. The product was war. And it was sold quite effectively, and most importantly, it was a propaganda effort, unfortunately with a willing partner with the corporate media. And you know, we saw that most dramatically at the New York Times, where Judith Miller, the chief national security correspondent, was being used by Bush and Cheney as a conduit for their slogans. And when I put the start date of that marketing campaign, September 8th, 2002, I believe it was the Sunday talk shows. I hope it wasn't your show, Bob. But that morning, a headline came out in the New York Times: the smoking gun may be a mushroom cloud. Remember, they had to somehow link Iraq to 9/11, which there was no link to. So Dick Cheney goes on one of the Sunday shows, and he says,
It wasn't me, because we got scooped that day.
Okay.
I remember it very well.
I knew it wasn't you, Bob. You're much smarter than all those other guys.
No, but
So anyway, Cheney says the smoking gun may be a mushroom cloud, but he famously adds, don't take it from me, take it from the New York Times. They just reported that this morning. But the slogan came from Cheney's office. So this dance of propaganda and news and what is what has, unfortunately, an illustrious history. Tim knows it goes back to World War II, but it was really elevated to a high art with government using the media in this propaganda two-step that sold us a war based on lies.
I'm just going to say, I take your point. I think you've made some very good points, but I don't totally agree with that. I covered that story. I was the Capitol Hill correspondent, and I can remember week after week, day after day, doing a story about the debate that was going on about this. So there are always ways we can do it better, but I think we did better than you're giving us credit for, David. But that's perfectly good for you to disagree on that.
I was working at CNN at the time. I was actually assigned to cover all the protests, both for and against the war. But, I remember when one of the senior editors walked in and the TV was on in my office and the banners, I can't remember what they said, but whatever those banners, the graphics, it was like, America at war, dang, 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 and we're, and I remember saying, I was like, why are we, CNN, doing this regarding this war? And I remember just saying, wait a second, we're supposed to be independent journalists, and it didn't feel that way. And I remember, because I also covered 9/11, that any voice of criticism of it was immediately like, what's the matter with you? So I agree with you, Bob, we did good, but this is the part of the self-critique of American journalism that is painful and hard, but necessary.
But I think we should continue that. Well, let's go to the audience. Who would like to ask a question here? And there are microphones in either aisle here. Step right up.
I want to thank all of you for having the courage to share your own perspectives, just to start off. And you all come from different lenses, and I think that's very obvious listening to all of you. Bob, you have a heart of gold, okay? And you see things from a different era, an era when people, okay, so I just want to preface it, my remarks, from a different era. So the reason I'm raising this is, how do you deal with the fact that truth is no longer valued, and we're in a place where journalism is not journalism as we had known it? Because Matt Taibbi's book, the Insane Clown President, talks about this not just happening now, it happened a while ago. So please try to address that if you can from your different lenses. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to approach it. Thanks for the question. And I'm going to approach this from a historic angle. I mean, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the last 200 years of the media, not just the last 10 years of the media. Not that I think all are important. And the question is, when we were talking about, say, some kind of golden age where you thought what was broadcast or the New York Times was in fact facts, where did that come from? It actually hasn't always been like that. If you picked up a newspaper in the 19th century, they routinely published absurd lies because they were good for subscriptions. The New York Sun in 1835 published a 7-part expose, labeled as fact, scientific report of who they'd found on the moon. And they found man bats and unicorns, and they just published it. And people thought, this is terrific, right? So this had to be earned somewhere. This idea of fact had to be earned and learned, and we have to relearn it. I think there's no substitute, ultimately, for ethics. I mean, it may seem naive to say that, but internal ethics, some sense of a code. And right now, social media is completely wild. That's anything. I mean, they have this excuse that we're tech people, we don't care about ethics. And I guess maybe the only direction to go is to finally be like, you are members of the media. You are responsible for this mess, for this loss of factualness and deprecation of our culture. It's up to you to fix it. And I think ethics is at least one place to start.
Well, I would, yeah. I would just say that what the role of the journalist is, the role of the reporter is to provide independently gathered, accurate information
that citizens can compare to the government's version of events. And then if we do that right, they'll figure out what to do. But we are not the opposition party, as Mr. Trump's White House would like to picture us as being. We're not, and I don't know anybody, any reporter I know who believes that we are the opposition party. We're not. We're not there to run the government. We're not there to run politics and political campaigns. Our job is to report on the people who are doing that. That's our assignment from the founders, and if we do that right, it's a crucial part of democracy. You can't have democracy without it. So I think I'm really proud to be a reporter, and I think I have an important job. I try not to take myself very seriously, but I take my responsibilities very seriously, and I take the truth seriously.
But Bob, if the president, if the president, this is where I get confused, because if the president has labeled us, you and me, as journalists, the enemy of the people, then are we at war? We didn't declare this war, but this is where I'm like, the rules of the game have changed for them, but what about for us? And we don't want to change the rules of the game. We stick by our facts, but at the same time, it's like he has declared a war on us. So how do we?
Well, it's not the first time that somebody's declared the war on the press. And I mean, this was going on all the way back to the founders, where the politics of that day was much nastier than it is today. We cannot be drawn into this war. We have to report on it. And we have one weapon, and that is to ask questions and to keep asking questions until we get answers. That's what our job is.
I fly into Tampa, and in the lobby of the hotel that I'm staying, the TV is tuned to Fox News.
Well, that's allowed.
There are a lot of people. There are a lot of people that don't get their news from Facebook. They get it from Fox. And my question is, what do you do about Fox?
Who wants to talk about that?
I mean, I don't think we can, I mean, I'm going to say something that you probably won't like, which is that Fox News it's a right-wing network, and anybody who watches it knows it's a right-wing network, and people with right-wing points of view are allowed to watch what they want to watch. I think the problem is largely one that probably we're all guilty of, which is that we don't do enough to seek out information that kind of rounds out our worldview, and that if you sit in a filter bubble where you're just getting crack cocaine, ideological crack cocaine, well then you're not going to be a great citizen. There's actually crack cocaine is maybe not the best metaphor. Can I work with Doritos? And I'm going to unpack this for you for just a minute. So 50 years ago, we had this revolution in food where suddenly we had TV dinners and processed foods, and it tasted so good, or at least that's what we thought, and it seemed incredibly efficient. There were no more pots and pans to clean up anymore. You didn't have to go to the store every day. And then we woke up many decades later and we said, holy cow, this stuff was engineered to make us fat. It totally remade the whole economics of producing food. And only belatedly did we start to pay attention to the things that we were ingesting in our mouth. And I would argue what's happening right now is that just as we became physically obese, we're kind of becoming mentally obese. And information is being reversed engineered to addict us in much the same sort of way that food was being reversed engineered to addict us. And that's a fault of media. It's a fault of these technology companies, and we need to find solutions for that as a society. But as individuals, we are citizens. We have to make important choices every couple of years about who we elect. And if we just rely on somebody to feed us information, if we don't pay for information, and we just get stuck with the free stuff, which is you get what you pay for. If we care about our world, we have to become benefactors of the type of information that we want the world to consume. We have to raise our kids in such a way in which they're taught good habits about news and information, where they're taught that they just can't get things off of a news feed. And so there's a whole world right now that's collapsing, and the food metaphor is disturbing, except for the fact that we have started. There are lots of pockets of society where we have come to care about what we eat, and we need to do the same with what we read and with what we watch on TV.
Thank you.
All right, over here. Thank you.
I teach media literacy, and that's exactly and my question is related to that and to the woman. I used to discourage my students from watching TV news, and now I prohibit them so they can at least get some more content. No, apologies. Two-part question. The Shorenstein Center on Media, Public Policy, and Politics came out with a study recently about how reading news on cell phones is basically making people dumber. To quote them, it's creating the threat of a second-class, less engaged citizen. And so I was wondering if anyone on the panel had thoughts about that, and I'd be curious for my students too. What are your three most important sources where you get news, or most interesting?
Let me just take the first part of that, because I was just at the Shorenstein Center Wednesday, and I believe that study was done by a professor at Texas A&M named Joanna Dunaway, if memory serves. I know she's done work in that area. Basically, what she is talking about is that, I guess, in a few years, at least 80% of us will have telephones, will have phones, and we will be, a lot of us will get our news from that. But when you go through various economic levels, when you get to the people at the lowest economic level, they do not use their telephone. I'm using an old-fashioned word, telephone here. We don't call them that anymore, but that just shows how old I am. The people at the lower economic levels do not use their phone as for news. For one thing, they can't afford the news apps that you and I can afford. They probably have done the so-called cord cutting because they can't afford cable anymore. The only time they're coming in contact with news is when their browser sort of kicks it up by accident, because there's probably not a newspaper if they're out in the Rust Belt part of the country in their town anymore. So what Dr. Dunaway is trying to say is that while the politically informed are becoming more informed, especially about politics, those at the other end of the economic scale are not getting any news at all. And I think that's what she means when she talks about, I think this is a very serious issue that needs to have a lot more discussion, because there's no question that it is going to widen the divide between the rich, poor, black, white, and so on and so on. Maybe somebody else on the panel would like to talk about that.
Well, I think some of the networks that are being energized are often excluded from the media, and those are the movements that are making change. So while the media focuses on what's going on under the Capitol Dome, they're not seeing, the Women's March that was not waiting for blessings from any of the corporate media to have this national outpouring of tens of millions of people just 2 days after Trump is inaugurated. These are the movements that continue to be energized. And for example, the whole repeal and replace, this wasn't a decision just by John McCain to turn his thumb down. It was all those people in wheelchairs who showed up, the people with disabilities who relied on Medicaid, the doctors who showed up in white coats. They're not looking for a black and white checkered flag to begin. They are being affected by these things, and I think one of the things that the media can do to be more relevant is to, reflect the voices. Look at what voices are not at the table. It's women, it's people of color, it's people with disabilities, it's people in indigenous communities like out at Standing Rock, which is, have been driving the climate change debate from a place that has been invisible to the media. So I think that while there are channels that are being energized by this, I have a lot of hope because of this, and I think that the media is following, not leading these efforts, but I do think it's important to ask who is not at the table and to go to where the silence is and make sure that, and bring these voices back. That is something the media can do.
Over here.
I think that the basic cause of the bifurcated discussion that we're having is the de facto two-party system. And I think the solution is ranked ballot voters ranking candidates in order of preference, count up the first choices, nobody has 50%, add in the next, and so on until someone finally does. That's the simplest explanation. And I would like to know what the panelists think about that.
Who'd like to take that one?
Can we just go back to the paper ballot?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't know about all of that, but I'm just like, can we just have actually a paper ballot that we can record? You know, I'm born in Mexico, but I was raised in Chicago politics. I mean, I do. I know it sounds silly, and people are like, whoa, let's do technology. I'm happy to bring back the paper
I
ballot.
have something to say about this. I mean, I'm willing to talk about constitutional design as much as anyone political theory, but but probably no one else here is. Maybe the gentleman. But I think actually we're having the right discussion first, because I do think the democracy really is reflective of and depends on the media environment. And we get, it is really driving it. Whether people, right now the polarization has a lot to do with who they need to appeal with through the kind of media environment we're in. That's always been true. And so getting these questions right, I'm saying that we're talking about on this panel, is as important, if not more important than any other aspect of constitutional design. That's all I'll say.
Right, that was here. Okay, over here.
So my name is Dr. Kiragan. I'm a new professor here. I study social media, and I just tweeted out that it was weird to be on Twitter and there's nobody else on Twitter with you. That's a weird experience at a panel that's about new media and a fake news age. And so I just want to, I know this is not proper for some people to just set a little context for this question. There's a huge generational gap in this room.
Yes, there is.
We're here at an institution of higher learning, and the students are upstairs. I don't know if there's mics up there or not.
There are no mics upstairs. Oh, wait. You mean
But it
that this
just-
is like there's only students up there, and then here it's like, what?
So, and I was sitting back there and I couldn't see any people who had darker skin. And then I looked to the panel and I'm like, this is you. And I love to see you here, Tim. I met Tim at the Wikipedian Day conference. I'm a Wikipedian, which will offend a lot of people. But it speaks to what this panel, to me, is about. I'm also a member of WBAI in New York City, alternative media. And I just, like, things are not the same. There is a war. I think you were absolutely right. What do we do to get, this is such a huge problem. Like, everything you said about our diet, how do we get more of the young people? I mean, we need more people up there on the stage and out here talking about what's going on in Albany that I've seen since I've been here, and what's going on in Puerto Rico, and what's going on with Black Lives Matter. This is not, I would love to hear you talk about, I didn't wear my resist button today. What do you recommend to hear those silenced voices for us?
Well,
and how can we get a couple of students up here in the line?
Let me just, in all fairness, the students have written questions down on
I know, but that's
on
still
pieces
part
of paper
it.
here, and
I'm just saying that's still
while
part
you
of
were
it.
talking, I was going through some of these, and I'll be happy to read some of them. And my eyes are not too good. Here's one.
You want me to go
Yeah.
ahead? Here we go. The Texas Tribune made its move towards a nonprofit sending reporters to its capital for government reporting because they simply have the means. As more newspapers fold to advancing technologies through its ability to share news as it's unfolding, do you think other newspaper entities will have to follow suit in order to compete with advancing technology? This is from Jacobin Forres, and the instructor. Well, we don't need to read the instructor, do we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, see, I've talked about this in my book, about what the Texas Tribune is doing, and it is, they raise their own money. Evan Smith, who used to be the editor of Texas Monthly, runs it, and basically with so many newspapers in Texas cutting back, he created this organization that covers the Texas legislature year-round. And they form the majority of the people now in the press gallery in Austin, which is the state capital. I'm from Texas, you know. And they are doing a tremendous job and really filling a void, because most of the newspapers in Texas can no longer afford to send someone to the state capitol to cover the legislature. And this is just another example of the difficulty that newspapers are facing now. When I was writing this book, one of the interesting to me anyway, facts that I came across was this. In 21 of the 50 states now, there is not a single newspaper that sends a correspondent to Washington to cover their local congressional delegation. They just can't afford to do it anymore. But the Tribune, the Texas Tribune, is really an excellent model. For ProPublica is another for people who are doing this kind of thing. And what they do is they cover the legislature, they cover state government, and they give the product away. They write stories, and any newspaper in Texas that wants it, they give it to them. So it's a very good question and a very good thing. See what this fellow said.
Sure, okay.
Can I respond to that? So the reason why I created the Futuro Media Group, and we raise all of the money. So I'm a media entrepreneur, I'm a businesswoman. We did this so that we could be independent and create our own public. So I would urge you, wherever you went, and all of you, to please take out your phones and subscribe to In the Thick and Latino USA on your podcast feed. Because what we do, so just to give you a context, so I was invited not to be on Bob's show. I'm not sure why. We'll have to talk about that later, but I was invited to be on another Sunday talk show that you'll figure out. And I was there many times. It was great. And then all of a sudden, they stopped inviting me, and I was like, what happened? What? I don't understand. So that frustration of being not seen, and at a time when, again, Mexican immigrants were like the focal of one person's campaign, that frustration meant that we just created our own, from something we created nothing, and we created In the Thick, which is our own Sunday politics podcast that doesn't come out on Sunday, just comes out on Tuesdays. But we talk to journalists of color, and from a POC perspective, because we see the young people, and that's why our audience on the show is huge, and why we beat NPR Politics to get nominated for a Webbing. So I would just say, one, of course, yes, subscribe to our media, but also be your own creators, right? I created something out of nothing because of frustration and because not feeling that my perspective was being seen when I was an equivalent American journalist. So for those of you there, create it. It's a level playing field. It's hard, but it's a level playing field because we are competing now against everybody else. And frankly, you know, Latino USA's radio audience grew by 45% last year.
All right, good. Here's another student question.
I've been appointed the reader of the student question. So this is a question from Hope Harris. Would the search and removal of fake news be so important or popular if it wasn't Donald Trump who had coined the term fake news?
Well, he didn't coin the term fake news to start with. He picked it up and started using it to label anything that he considered uncomplimentary. But fake news, and what we were all talking about before he picked up this term, is news that's simply made up out of whole cloth for propaganda purposes or both domestic and foreign. Would anybody else like to?
I actually did some research into the term itself. You know, before, about a year or two ago, it used to refer to things like The Onion. But what I think the older word for fake news, the most accurate word, is atrocity propaganda, which is to say, in war it used to be very common, World War I, British were the pioneers of this, is to get the population really riled up, you accuse whatever group it is of atrocities. You know, so the Germans were accused of bayoneting children and barbecuing them or something like that. And it gets people so insane. And you can see a lot of fake news right now, like the pedophilia ring you were talking about. It's not just a little bit false, it's designed to make you get a gun and do something. So that's the actually accurate term historically.
Okay, let's go back to the audience. Which side was on? There? Okay, here.
I'd like to ask you to turn your attention to the other end of the pipe, to the consumer of your journalism. As an educator, I'm very interested to know whether you think the consumers, especially the younger consumers, many of whom are not here, are any better or worse prepared to deal with a variety of news compared to people before the internet and the earlier generation?
I think they're very smart. And I think for the most part, a lot of them are able to separate it. But there's still a lot of confusion out there because there's just so much news. This is going to have to be our last question. So let's just go down the line and let you all talk about that. Franklin?
Well, I think really fake news, propaganda, it's not just, I don't see a big age gap there. I think if I look at the last election and the ways in which people, it was a lot of people who grew up in a culture of 3 television networks and big newspapers who were also susceptible to a lot of the stuff that the Russians were peddling. I hope that we, the Russian issue, which is such a potent illustration of the way in which the system is broken, and the deeper we dig into it, we see that they were exploiting racial animosity. They were exploiting a system where people felt rage, but the rage they were exploiting was there to begin with, and it has many causes. It's stuff that, as Maria said, is just baked. Some of it is baked into the American soul. Some of it is, but some of it has gotten worse as our media environment has shifted into this way in which we live within these filter bubbles. And all I would say, I'll make one, just my closing pitch is similar to what Maria was saying, which is that sometimes in this world, we feel such little sense of agency when it comes to confronting these problems. The idea that we would be active in terms of trying to do something to reshape something like our media environment, it's such a foreign concept to us. There's one essay that George Orwell wrote in the 1940s called Cigarettes versus Books. And the article was, he was trying to implore his fellow Brits to actually buy books. And he said, he went through and he did an inventory of his library, and he figured out how much he'd spent on books in the last year, and then how much he'd spent on cigarettes. And then he did the same math for the average person. And it turns out that, for whatever reason, the average Brit felt that cigarettes were much more important to their sense of enjoyment and fulfillment than the consumption of books. And that, the idea that we would subscribe to a newspaper, it's so expensive, but there's so many trivial things that we spend more money on. And the same is true with our attention, that we spend so much of our attention on things that are ultimately fairly trivial. And you see this with your phone. Your phone exists to try to steal your attention constantly. You're always being notified and dinged and pinged, and somebody is trying to redirect you to whatever it is that they want to redirect you to. And we've become guinea pigs in this experiment where when the bell rings, we pick up our phones and look at it. And sometimes the bell isn't even ringing. We feel that the phone is ringing in our pants. It's a phantom buzz. But the point is just that even if these forces are powerful, you're powerful too.
That is a great point, and I have to say, the bell is ringing, and we've had a great panel here, and you all have been a very great audience. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
I had a couple words, a reminder. that the doors will open early. The 8 p.m. panel, Presidents in the Press, Trump, Nixon, and more. Bob Schieffer will be the moderator again. We're sorry if we left you at the microphones. The students, we only asked you to sit in the balcony because you have young legs. We have people with mobility issues down here. It's the only reason. If there's empty seats, come down to the main floor tonight, please. And I want to thank our panel, Franklin Foer, David Goodman, Maria Hinojosa, Tim Wu, and Bob Schieffer.